Hi, I'm Eric Colette.
And I'm Randy Vaudry.
And we're memory coaches from A Mind for All Seasons. And we want to talk to you today about something that we get asked about all the time, and that's how do you improve your brain functioning? There's a ton of research out there that shows all sorts of things that impact brain health and brain functioning. And people all the time say, what could I do to greatly diminish my risk of Alzheimer's disease or other types of dementia? I heard that there's research out there. I've heard there are things that I can do. I've heard there are lifestyle options. But where do I even start? Now, the answer is actually fairly complex. There are about 50 different factors that you'd want to look at to have a real comprehensive, thorough program to address brain health. But we want to give you the top 10 things. 10 things that you can look at and be aware of, and most of these you can do or have a conversation with your primary care provider about to really mitigate some of the risk of cognitive decline. And to explain why you would even want to do this, I'll just point out the fact that if you live past age 65 and you're a woman, you got about a 1 in 2 shot of developing Alzheimer's disease based on current statistics and trends. If you're a man, it's about a 1 in 3 chance of developing Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. And neither of those is great. So let's dive in and we'll talk about these 10 things that you can do and be aware of that really will cut your risk dramatically. So Randy, what's the first?
So this is not necessarily number one because it's the most important, but it's just one that we wanted to talk about first because it's so easy for everyone, and it's doing a little bit of exercise. Now, everyone out there knows that exercise is essential for good brain functioning. But it's oftentimes sold to us in a way that we should exercise to lose weight or we should exercise to improve our joints. But the truth is exercise does so many beautiful things to help our minds. One of the things that it does is it stimulates a hormone called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This isn't a test. You're not going to ask to be repeating that. But just remember that when we exercise, there are hormones that are like growth factors for our brain that stimulate the production of new brain cells and allows us to help clear out some of the metabolic trash of old brain cells. And it probably doesn't even matter what kind of exercise that you do. If you like to swim or you do aerobics, if you like to have a walking program or lift weights, if you're a mountain climber and you hike, or if you just simply like to do some yoga, every single one of those interventions has an opportunity to stimulate the hormones and do the types of things metabolically that we need to protect our mind. Eric, what's another one?
Well, before we move on, I just want to clarify one thing for everybody watching. As a physician, how much would you recommend that people actually exercise? What should they really do, and how often should they do it?
Great question. And the right answer is often as you can. There's a lot of recommendations from the American Heart Association or the American College of Cardiology that talks about engaging in 45 minutes to an hour at least 3 or 4 times a week. But each organization has a different recommendation, and the answer is that you ought to do it as often as you can. So a good recommendation would be 5 days a week. If you can get out and walk or do some form of exercise enough to elevate your heart rate, get some deep breathing, and get that blood flowing, you're going to get benefit out of it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. The next thing that we'd really want to look at is a pretty big category. In fact, it affects everybody universally. We're talking about diet. And there are a few things more controversial than diet. Yeah. You bring up diet and everybody seems to come out of the woodwork and everybody has an opinion about how to eat. And rather than telling you exactly how to eat, we want to talk about some basic principles here. Alzheimer's disease is nicknamed diabetes type 3, or diabetes of the brain, because in about 50% of the cases, there's a lot of insulin resistance. And diet is heavily implicated in Alzheimer's disease and explains why people that live in certain areas have much lower rates of Alzheimer's disease, and people that live here in the United States where we eat the standard American diet, the SAD diet, have much higher rates of Alzheimer's disease than certain areas. Why is it, for example, that if you eat a Mediterranean diet, you have a much lower risk of Alzheimer's disease? Well, when you dig into it, you find out that it has a lot to do with this factor of insulin resistance. Insulin is basically the vehicle that delivers sugar to the cells. And if you're constantly flooded with high levels of insulin because you're eating lots and lots of sugar in the form of refined sugars and processed foods and high levels of grains, all of which are part of the standard American diet, then your insulin levels are high chronically. And if you're eating late night snacks and not really having a long period of time for that insulin level to drop, then it stays high pretty consistently. And as a result, the insulin receptors in our bodies become less sensitive. It's kind of like walking into a crowded room and hearing all the noise and then having the fire alarm going off, and pretty soon you're covering your ears because there's just so much noise and distraction, and it's so hard to take. Our insulin receptors do basically the same thing. They want to tone things down because they're tired of how loud the signaling has been. Well, if insulin is what delivers sugar to the cells, or puts fuel in the tank, if you will, if we become resistant to that signaling, it gets harder and harder to get fuel in the tank. And that's what's driven a 30% increase in type 2 diabetes over the last few decades. It's the thing that's driving the obesity epidemic, and it's a major factor in driving brain dysfunction. If you've ever had brain fog where you just can't quite think straight and you're having a hard time putting your thoughts together, in a lot of cases, just fixing insulin resistance and eating differently will help the fog to lift and you'll feel a lot better. So rather than telling you exactly how to eat, let's talk about some principles. In general, it's important to reduce your sugar intake and increase the amount of healthy fat that you're eating. Now, granted, some fats are really bad. We still want to stay away from the trans fats and the hot processed pressed cooking oils that get used. But some fats are very neuroprotective. After all, your brain's like a great big ball of fat. So things like olive oil and avocados and avocado oil and nuts and seeds are all really essential to our functioning, and they're all important parts of a healthy diet. So if you can increase the amount of those healthy fats and decrease the sugars that you're eating, it can have a huge impact on how you feel and even how you look in the mirror. So a lot to be gained from that. Randy, what would you add to the list?
You know, you talked about the importance of fats, and just about everyone knows how essential omega-3s are, or fish oils. And so everything that you've talked about, most everyone understands if we could get rid of the processed food and the junk food and focus more on a diet that was rich in vegetables and fruits and healthy fats, we would go such a long way of protecting our brain. And dietary guidelines are probably the number one reason people reach out to us for coaching for Alzheimer's disease or cognitive dysfunction, because there's so many people out there trying to sell a product and a quick fix. But the truth is, you just really have to dial in healthy foods and get rid of the processed foods, and it makes a difference.
You mean I can't just take a pill and save my brain?
No, but
it's a lifestyle choice?
You can do a couple of other things. I'm going to go on to number 3. And again, this is something that's been studied and everyone knows about. And it's something that if we lack, we have terrible days, and it's sleep. Everyone knows how important sleep is. In fact, in my primary care office, when people come seeking guidelines for cognitive dysfunction or dementia, it's not uncommon that they ask me for sleeping medication. And that's very tricky because most sleeping medications are designed to turn the mind off so that you can go to bed at night. The hard part is that we don't wake up and take a pill to turn the mind off. And sometimes those medications have other problems associated with them. So a couple of guidelines to consider is that when we go to bed at the same time every night and wake up at the same time in the morning, our body gets into a very cyclic routine. And this cyclic routine improves our sleep quality and improves our ability to get into deep, relaxing sleep. The result of that is it clears our mind. At nighttime, it's also when we get deep into REM sleep that we clear certain elements of our brain so that when we wake up in the morning, it's kind of like cleaning out the cobwebs in an old room where we dust the room off and we clean out the junk and the mind is ready to function. In my practice, I can tell you that most of my patients want to be tested early in the morning versus late at night, because early in the morning they're crisp and they're bright and they're more vibrant when it comes to their neurological functioning. There's so many things that we could help coach our clients on how to improve their sleep. It's something that you've got to consider. Eric, what's another one?
Well, kind of related to something we talked about earlier. When you're talking about exercise, you mentioned brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's like Miracle-Gro for brain cells. And that sounds like a really good thing, and it is. And we obviously want to have as much of that as possible. And we know that physical activity will boost levels of BDNF. But there's another thing that can help us a lot: fasting. It turns out there's a reason that all the major religions of the world, in one way or another, use fasting as part of religious practice. Because fasting, it turns out, sharpens the mind. There's a growing body of really solid research showing that when you go for 12 or more hours without food, your body starts to produce higher levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Part of that is because you've got to be able to figure out where your next meal's going to come from. So if you're staying away from food for a while, your brain kind of fires up. But it also has to do with the fact that your insulin level is dropping, your BDNF level is going up, and when we're fasting, our bodies are taking out the trash. That's part of what also makes sleep so important. You're not up eating when you're sleeping. So we would encourage you at least a few times a week to try going 12 hours from the time that you have your evening meal till the time that you eat again the next day. Now, stay hydrated, although not too much, because we don't want you interrupting your quality sleep to just get up and run to the bathroom. But perfectly fine to have some water or coffee or tea in the morning to make sure that you're staying hydrated and you have a little bit of fluid in you, but stay away from the food until you've gone 12, 14, maybe even 16 hours from the time that you ate that evening meal, which really is pretty easy to do. For most people, it just means that you cut out the snack right before bed. And if you're eating a diet rich in healthy fats that promote satiety, then you're not going to be quite as hungry and craving that late night bowl of ice cream to tide you through. And if you don't have the sugars right before bed, you're not going to be starving the next morning either. I personally do this a lot. Part of that is that I get going on things in the morning and it's just less convenient to stop and eat breakfast. And so I often don't eat until 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. And I don't miss it. I actually find that I do really well. And so we'd invite you to give it a shot. Now, we've talked about exercise. We've talked about the importance of how we eat. We've talked about sleep. We've talked about fasting. What else might we look at?
You know, Eric, one of the key components in our aging seniors is optimizing hormones. And this starts to get a little bit tricky, and some people would even say maybe a little controversial, because there's so much data that has been released about hormones and whether or not they're good or bad for the aging mind. But I'm here to tell you, statistics show that women who have a hysterectomy early in their life have a twofold greater risk of Alzheimer's disease than women who go through natural menopause. And we've learned that's because estrogen's influence on the brain is protective. Just like estrogen is protective to the bones in osteoporosis, it protects the brain from degeneration. Now the hard part becomes, what if you've had a hysterectomy because you've had cancer? Then naturally that's a reason we have to be careful of. But estrogen's not the only hormone we talk about optimizing. We often optimize testosterone, DHEA, pregnenolone levels. Eric talked about optimizing insulin, which is a hormone, and we do that through diet modification. We can optimize thyroid. And thyroid is so important because I have so many senior women, these cute little ladies that in the middle of summertime in Arizona are sitting with a throw blanket because they're freezing cold. Think of that. If your thyroid's functioning well, you shouldn't be cold all the time. And so those are opportunities that we use to optimize the hormones, and it dramatically improves the functioning of the brain. Eric, would you add anything to the topic of hormones?
Well, just the fact that as you're discussing it, I'm thinking back on the 4 times that my wife has been expecting children, and every time she's had pregnancy brain, where things just get a little fuzzier and it's harder to remember things. And I've talked to so many women that have been through that, or so many men that have watched their loved ones go through that. And it makes a lot of sense that hormones really do affect how the brain functions.
Yeah, and if you think of men, I spoke mostly about women, but guys, there's a lot of research that's talking about low testosterone levels as we age. And we all know that growth hormone is very protective for our joints and our muscles, and it's also protective for the brain. So there's a time and a place, and we always look at risks versus benefits. But if you're struggling with cognitive functioning and you're worried about Alzheimer's, we ought to have a discussion about optimizing hormones.
You know, the one other thing I'd add about hormones is that a lot of people, I think, will go to their doctor and say, hey, I think I've got a thyroid problem. And the doctor will check their TSH level and look at it and say, you're normal. I think it's important to recognize there's a very big difference between normal and optimal. The normal range is developed by testing 100 people or so, and you throw out the top 2.5% of the scores and the bottom 2.5% of scores. The remaining 95%, that's normal. And man, if you ask any guy that's been on the low side of normal with their testosterone, it is not the same as if they're higher up. Normal ranges are kind of like if I lost a shoe and my wife said, well, here, you can use one of mine. And I started walking around in that shoe all day, and I was in pain, and I went to the shoe store to try to do something about it. And the clerk looked at the shoe that I had for my wife and said, oh, well, it's an 8. I don't know what to tell you. It's a normal shoe size. I mean, we think that the clerk was crazy, but that's kind of the mindset when it comes to normal ranges on labs. So one of the things important to us at A Mind for All Seasons when we're really coaching people and working with the clients that we have is to look at what is optimal for them. What's going to help them actually feel right? And how do we do sometimes a more extensive panel of testing to really figure out what's going to feel the best and what's going to optimize their functional level?
Yeah, that's very well said. I have never felt like normal is optimal. And I've sat across the exam table from hundreds of clients over the last 14 years that come in and say, Randy, I feel awful. And I have to say, well, your labs are normal? I mean, that's a tragedy. That happens every day in America. And so good health practitioners and good coaches work with clients to find out, even if you've been told all your labs are normal, they might not be optimal.
Yeah, really, really good point. The next thing that we want to talk about in our top 10 list is really pretty easy, and I think it's one of the most fun. Social activity, it turns out, is neuroprotective. There's a lot of research that shows that people who have more social connections have lower rates of cognitive decline. And I'm not sure that we know all of the reasons why. Certainly there's a use it or lose it kind of mentality. But there's something that the brain loves about being social. We are, as humans, a very social type of creature. And there's something about isolating ourselves and cutting ourselves off from other people that just is not healthy. So get out there and join a group, or make sure that you're having positive social interaction with people. Meeting new people and having to learn new names and having to learn about the background of somebody is not only fun and engaging, but it's also important for your brain. So get out there and talk to people.
In addition to what Eric said, there's a part of Alzheimer's disease that causes people to retract. And sometimes they feel embarrassed or they're very self-conscious. And I've talked to many clients who they don't want to be social because they struggle to remember the name of their next door neighbor, and they've lived next to him for 50 years, and it gets embarrassing. And so it becomes kind of a natural result of the disease process when our brain is deteriorating that we become less social. But like Eric said, we need to find opportunities to help people go to church and go to the senior center and go to an exercise class with the silver sneakers or whatever that intervention will be to help people be more social. It really will protect their mind.
Yeah, and I think part of what you're saying, Randy, is sometimes people need a little extra nudge. Part of why we do coaching at A Mind for All Seasons is to help people know how to deal with those situations. And certainly everything that we do in our programmatic approach to brain health can boost people and help them function enough better in some of those social settings that they're able to get over that hurdle. And sometimes they just need to know that someone's cheering for them and that it's okay to get out there and put your best foot forward, whatever that looks like. So I think all of that works together to the good of people that we're working with. I think that brings us to number 7. What would you add?
Brain training. Now you might think, what is brain training? Well, everyone knows if I said go do an exercise class and do some exercises, that's intuitive. You know what doing exercising means. But when I say brain training, it might not be as intuitive. And the fact is that the brain is an organ. I was going to say it's a muscle, but like Eric said, it's really just a big ball of fat and nerves. But it's an organ that does really well when we stress it. But the brain doesn't do squats and the brain doesn't walk on a treadmill. The way we stress the brain is we do some brain training. And a lot of people are familiar with doing word searches or doing crossword puzzles. But there's some new software that's been released, and Eric and I don't have a financial relationship with any of these companies. But there's opportunities to do brain training where you can test your mind on how fast your processing speeds are at looking at certain items and then recalling them, or memorizing and spitting those facts and data back out. That there's mazes and there's trail making and there's a lot of things that we can do from a brain training aspect. And the research is overwhelming that shows the mind is very plastic. And when we train the brain, just like training an athlete, the brain gets faster, it gets sharper, and it's more able to handle new information and new data and new memories as time goes on.
That's awesome. I read an article just a couple of days ago about brain training that pointed out that some of the results from a really good brain training program can last as long as 10 years after the program is stopped. That's really pretty impressive. Now, one thing I'd add when it comes to brain training is the fact that it's really important to seek out novel experiences. I read years ago that traveling